Welcome to Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and this is episode 4. Joining us today is Lance Leduc. He is the at-large for the State Central Committee of the Libertarian Party of Connecticut, and he is also going to be the chairperson for the upcoming convention for the Libertarian Party of Connecticut, which will be held this December. Welcome to the Rational Egoist, Lance.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
We'd love to have you here. So Lance and I are both libertarians, and he is for secession and I am opposed to it. So we thought it would be interesting if we had a discussion or a debate about the issue. So before we get started, Lance, what does secession mean to you?
Yeah, actually, that's a great way to start the conversation. I think I see secession in context to how we're going to be talking about it as it's kind of a right that we have. It's part of self-ownership.
Okay.
I think that we all have a right to associate with who we like or who we don't, and disassociate with who we don't. I think that's a freedom we have to peacefully disengage from people that we enjoy and engage with people who we don't. Or I'm sorry, disengage with people who we don't.
Okay, so would you be for, say, Connecticut seceding as a state from the Union?
I would love it if Connecticut would secede. Now, do I think it's going to happen? Is it practical to think that this is something that's going to happen in my lifetime? I think that's a different conversation. Well, it's wrapped up in the same conversation, but I think it's a different thing altogether. I know I listened to your podcast recently, speaking with I forget the gentleman's name. He hosts the libertarianism.uk
Andy
podcast.
Duncan.
Andy Duncan. And I know that's one way the conversation veered off was, do you foresee this happening? Is it practical? That type of thing. I think that's hopefully something we can cover, but I think I would love for Connecticut to secede from the Union.
Okay, so would you say that the entire principle of secession has to do with an individual's right to consent to be a part of whatever government he chooses to be a part of? In other words, is the consent of the governed the principle upon which secession rests?
Yeah, consent is a pillar of that self-ownership I was talking about, right? Like we have to, if I don't consent to something, it's no longer peaceful. That the interactions are no longer peaceful, and I think at that point, if I'm forced to consent, that's kind of an oxymoron. If I'm forced to engage, I'm now in a situation where my rights to associate or disassociate have been violated, and now there's no peace. Because what does force mean? Ultimately, especially at the state level, it's some guy with a gun is going to hog tie you behind your back and throw you in a locked room, right? So, it's just not peaceful.
Okay, so this is to me where the libertarian case for secession falls apart. I wholeheartedly believe that any individual or group of individuals has the absolute right to withdraw from a tyrannical government. You will get no argument out of me there, right? But when you talk about a state seceding, when you talk about Connecticut seceding, unless you have the unanimous consent of every member of the state of Connecticut, then by definition, you are going to be taking other people away from the United States without their consent, thereby doing the exact thing that you're claiming the United States government is doing to you. So that's why that's one of the reasons I'm opposed to it, because it just doesn't work without violating the very principle that you're trying to uphold.
Sure. So you're kind of looking at it as a collectivist behavior.
It is a
collective.
It would have to be, because you're talking about a state seceding. Now, if you, me, and 100 guys all said enough of this, like I said, practicality issues aside, because you're right, it's just not practical. But we have every right to form a unit. But if everybody's not consenting and we plan on taking them with us, then we're doing it against their consent and violating their rights.
Sure. So this starts to dive into a great part of the conversation, which really opens up there's like the philosophy, and then what would it have to look like if
Yes.
this was ever to be put into place. And so let me start by saying I agree with you. Like, if a state was to secede to become its own state, there's a collectivist, there's a bit of collectivism there, right? So I do agree with that premise. But I think it's important to recognize that, I mean, there's a couple of different points that I want to make here. One, this is why state secession is not as great as secession at the individual level, right? And what we're doing is we're trying to make this one thing that libertarians believe very almost across the board is that the state isn't the answer, right? To almost any issue, any given problem, the state isn't the answer. Individuals, a truly free market, peaceful interaction can solve, or not necessarily solve every issue, because not every issue is solvent. It has the possibility of being solved, but it can do the most good and the least harm if you remove the state. Because comparing our ideas up against perfect, and this is an important part of this conversation, I know this is a little bit long-winded, but comparing any of our ideas up against perfect, I think, is not fair, because we don't have perfect and we'll never have perfect.
No,
Especially
it's like
if the given is that a state's going to be the result of whatever we're doing. So that's what we're talking here. We're talking a just more decentralized version of a state,
right.
which I think is just more good than what we currently have. So if one state secedes and says we're not falling into this federal state, you're just pulling away from that more centralized form of governance.
Okay, well, first of all, I agree with you that we cannot make perfect the principle that we're arguing against, because that constantly happens to me when I'm arguing for capitalism, and they say, well, you're going to have some guy, this is going to happen. But that stuff happens under any system. Nothing's going to be perfect, right? We're talking about what is going to protect the rights of the people. But I just noticed that you did a little switch in the discussion just now, because we started off discussing secession as a right based on the fact that I didn't consent to a tyrannical government. Therefore, I have the right to secede from it. But if I have that right, so does everybody else. Therefore, if a state secedes as a whole, unless everybody agrees, some people within that group are going to have their rights violated, their right of consent, right? But then what you said was, well, decentralized is better, works better than centralization. So the smaller the unit, the better. But you switch from a rights-based argument to a utilitarian argument. And a lot of the problems that I have with secession revolve around the very things that we're talking about. Because aside from it's not being practical on a level of the United States government, first of all, is not going to let a state secede. Secondly, a state like Connecticut, the majority of the state likes the way that it's running, so it's not going to secede on the type of principles that you and I are advocating. But more importantly, the entire concept ends up falling apart because it relies on the idea of consent, and you're going to end up taking people who don't consent, and then you're going to switch the argument into a decentralized state that's going to work better, but nonetheless, you're going to be violating people's rights.
Well, so Mike, the only reason I'm doing that, I feel like I'm trying to operate. You asked me, I'm trying to answer the question you asked specifically about would you be for Connecticut seceding? So it automatically puts me in a place where I have to answer.
Well, take any state. Forget Connecticut. Take any state.
Yeah, well,
any
obviously Connecticut's a worse example than, let's say, Texas, right? But what I'm saying is, no matter what the state is, if the question that's being posed is, should that state be able to secede and form its own government, which is ultimately what you're asking. Yes, you're putting me in a situation where I have to defend what I really ultimately don't want to defend, right? That's why I also said what you left out of my answer there was that the best secession is the individual secession, right? And so
you will get no argument out of me.
Yeah, I know you agree with that. It's important that we do this, right?
Yes.
Like, these are the questions we're going to be asked. Yeah. So, but I think that ultimately, if the box that I'm being put in is well, are you for, really the question then is, are you just for more decentralized government? That's what's really being asked of me when you say, should Connecticut secede from the union, or should any state secede from the union?
Well,
To that, I
hold on
would
one
say,
second. Because
yep.
originally I asked, this is why I asked the question at the beginning, what does secession mean? Because as I've looked into the libertarian case for secession, the contemporary case, it has to do with states seceding, right? Even if that's just the beginning of a series of decentralizations, which would ultimately break down to the individual, it has to do with the state seceding. So that concept, when you and I first had the talk, was what I was thinking about in terms of secession, is a state seceding from the union. And there's no way the argument doesn't end up collapsing on itself from libertarian principles. So, and aside from the fact that the main reason I want to get clarification on this issue is because you, as a member of the SCC, and I'm the spokesperson for the party, I want to understand these issues more in depth so that I'm able to better communicate them when I need to. Now, if I ever had to make the case for secession, so I try to do that in my own head, and I end up with a myriad of contradictions that just don't exist together. And I think the part of the problem is that we have things as they are, and then we have things as we would like them to be, right? So the current structure is you have a United States government and you have 50 states, and then within each state you have multiple localities and whatnot. That's just the way things are organized. So if you were going to try to secede from the state of Connecticut as an individual, first of all, you couldn't. They would come and they would take your money from you. So they would take your taxes, and if you refuse to pay, they would put you in jail. So it seems that we're better served by simply advocating right now in the state of Connecticut for smaller government, less taxes, more individual liberty, and staying away from the secession case. And then you end up with this. You believe, and this is a tricky thing, and I'm not trying to trick you. What I want to do is get clarification. Do you believe that consent is vital for a government to be just?
Of course, you're moving fast, and there's things I want to answer as
I'm
you're
sorry.
going here.
I apologize.
No, you don't have to apologize. To answer that question, that's a very simple yes for me.
Okay.
Right? Consent phrase the question again.
Do you think that in order for a government to be just, that consent is necessary?
The consent of the governed, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So yes. Yeah. I mean, that's otherwise. You're right. I mean, that's one of the basic pillars of libertarianism in a sense.
Let me say that it's not, and I'll explain why.
Okay.
Suppose I punch you in your face, right?
Yeah.
Do you need my consent to retaliate against me?
No.
Okay. Suppose there's you and two of your friends and I attack you. Would either one of your friends need my consent in order to take me off of you?
No, of course not.
Okay, of course not. So a proper government, according to libertarian theory, is basically a defense pact, a mutual defense pact, right? Whereas whatever it's okay for an individual to do, it's okay for the group to do, and so on and so forth. So if I have a right to self-defense, you and I can enter into a mutual self-defense pact, add another person, so on and so on and so on. And as long as we keep our self-defense and retaliatory force as our method of protecting our rights, we're good. If we stray from that and violate people's rights by using force against them, then we're violating a libertarian principle. So now if you, me, and say 100,000 other people have a mutual defense pact, and Joe K, I've just made that name up, lives in our territory, he doesn't have to consent to our governorship in order to be subject to our jurisdiction. If he violates anybody's rights within that jurisdiction, we still have the right to use the government force against him. So his consent is completely irrelevant. What's relevant is the principles by which the government operates. That's the key, because even if you have a majority that consents to being thieves, we would never say, okay, that makes it okay. And then you need universal consent, which you're never going to get in any society. It's never happened anywhere, not beyond, maybe a condominium complex or, places like that. Do you follow? Do you follow my reasoning?
I follow what you're saying, but I don't feel like it's fair to my reason for secession. And I
Okay.
feel like you've thrown about 10 things at me and I haven't been able to answer any of them here. Okay. And I've actually lost some of what we were talking about now.
I'm sorry, Lance.
So to go what you were just saying, there's no apology needed, but to go with what you were just talking about, again, I'm being put in a box where this is what, so I would not advocate for anything other than a voluntary government governing system, right? And all the way down to the individual. And there's a lot of people in the libertarian camp that would agree with that. Almost all. Now, not all would agree with like an anarcho-capitalist society, but it would be voluntary, whatever it is. Some libertarians identify that they would like to live in a socialist community, right? But what we all agree to is that like natural law, right? So yes, if you punch somebody in the face, they have a right to defend themselves, right? These are rights that we inherently have. Some people think it comes from their creator. Some people just think it's, I am me, therefore I have these rights. And whether every government building burned down tomorrow or not, if somebody breaks into my house and attacks me and my family, I can protect myself because that is just a natural right that I have, right?
Yes.
I have a right to think and have this conversation with you. That exists whether the Constitution goes up in flames tomorrow or not,
Yes.
right? So I feel like the state secession conversation, to go back to what we were really talking about, you asked me what is secession to me. I answered in like a philosophical answer, not necessarily what does it mean in like the popular society in terms of talking about states seceding. States seceding, again, it's not my perfect solution. Do I think it's better than 350 million governed by roughly 600? Yes, I do. And I think that brings about more peace, more freedom, more liberty, and less death and turmoil and poverty and all these other things that are happening at the hands of the state, at the hands of a more heavily centralized state. I don't think the argument necessarily falls apart completely just because now you're going to have some people, like there are levels. Do me a favor, go back to, let's tackle this one point at a time. Go back to what you were asking about, where you think it like falls apart.
I think it falls apart, assuming you're talking about states seceding. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's so we're agreed that that's where we are now, at the state level seceding.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So unless, and that's based on the principle of the consent of the governed, that if the people within the state don't consent to be governed by the federal government, they have a right to secede from the union.
Okay.
Are we in agreement so far?
That's a general idea of what secession is, right?
And my point to you was that there's going to be people within that jurisdiction that's seceding who are not going to consent to secession. So now you're doing to them what your argument is the federal government is doing to you. Gotcha. You're putting them in a position to be governed by people they're not consenting to.
Right. Which in my perfect world, if you were to say, Lance, what's the best way to organize society? Nobody would be using the government to do our own dirty work. I wouldn't be using the government to force other people to live the way that I want to live, right? But that's not what we're talking about. So automatically, I'm being forced to defend creating a government.
Yes.
As somebody who hates government, right?
Yes.
So what I want to acknowledge,
and that, by the way, Lance, is precisely my point from the get-go.
Right.
Is the position puts you in a position to violate the principles that you agree with, the principles that you live your life.
But you're also acting in defense. But there's two things to that. One, you're also acting in defense of your own rights. And if it's not practical, what's more practical? We're talking about practicality a little bit.
Yes.
What's more practical, a state seceding or an individual seceding?
I would say that at this point in time, neither. As far as something practical that's going to occur, the federal government would never go for it. But here's the thing. You and I would agree on this. Do you believe that within society, individuals have the right to say do drugs if they want to, any drugs they want.
Yes.
They want to get high as long as they're not, maybe driving or, violating other people's rights. They have the right to do drugs. I would agree. I'm guessing do you agree with me that taxation is ultimately theft?
Of
And
course.
the thing to do is move as close, lower taxes as much as we can as a practical.
Right, but so let me ask you this.
Yes.
What if a group of morons really wants to pay a whole lot more taxes and votes against me to pay more taxes?
This is the whole key now. They are violating your rights. And remember at the beginning, I said that individuals or groups of individuals absolutely have the right to secede from any tyrannical government unit, whatever. I would never disagree with that. It's when you extrapolate it to the state level where I had the issue. And as a practical matter, now what we're talking about is this. I think that you and I would probably agree on 99% of what laws should be. In other words, what behaviors should not be prohibited and what behaviors should be prohibited, right?
Natural law, that'd be about it for me.
Yeah. I can't imagine you'd find too much disagreement. Capitalism's great. The economy should be deregulated. Mask mandates, all that stuff was garbage. People should be able to live their lives how they choose as long as they're not violating other people's rights. We would both, I think, agree on that, right? So then the question to me becomes, what is the best method of implementing that in society? And by the time you were at the point where you can secede, you would already have had to convince enough people of the libertarian message anyways, in order to secede along the lines that you would want to secede. So instead of focusing on secession, where people then want to argue about that, why not have the debates on areas that, first of all, we agree on, secondly, where we're much stronger on, where they don't have a counter. They don't have a counter to the idea that
that's a different conversation.
Theft.
That's why. The answer to that is that's a different conversation. Is the conversation secession moral? Is it good? Is it more good or less good than other things or something like that? Not, is it practical?
Well, the first,
or is it something that we should be attacking?
The first thing that we were discussing was, I'm against secession year 4. That's how we started off, right? And what I'm doing is I'm bringing you through the chain of reasons that I'm opposed to it. So I started off by saying, first of all, the state as a unit seceding would inevitably lead to violating the very rights of other people that you're upset at having your rights violated.
No, and I haven't really been able to answer that.
Okay, so we'll back up a little bit and go ahead and tell me how a state can secede without violating anybody's rights. That's
not my answer.
Okay, so
see, this is what I mean. I keep getting constantly put in this box of,
well, I assumed you
really making me answer. This is actually exactly what you said you didn't like, which was putting our ideas up against perfect. It's not perfect.
No.
Any form of government is going to have people's rights violated.
No, I disagree 100%. Disagree 100%. If that is that might right there be the linchpin upon which the entire disagreement exists. Because even in a perfectly anarcho-capitalist society where you have competing defense agencies, what those are basically mini governments. And if you believe that those mini governments can exist without violating people's rights, then there's no reason why a larger government couldn't exist without violating people's rights. Now, if you're asking me if it's likely to happen, I would say no. But
I think we might have just agreed.
Yeah, the principle isn't that government doesn't by necessity in its very existence entail violating rights. A government could exist without violating people's rights.
Has it in the history of mankind?
Well, no, but there's never been a successful anarcho-capitalist city. I mean, city or state or country either. That's thrived along libertarian principles. Now, there's been, in Iceland and amongst some Native American tribes, no centralized state. That's true, but they haven't operated along libertarian principles. And that is ultimately what we want. It's just a matter of the different means of attaining that.
Okay, but we can agree that in the history of mankind,
yes,
as soon as governments start forming, somebody within that territory doesn't agree with the rules, and therefore, by libertarian principles, their rights on some level are being violated.
No, I would say just because somebody disagrees, I could think that I have the right to beat you up and you say, no, you don't. That doesn't mean my rights are being violated. That only happens if you have a subjectivist view of rights that says whatever a person believes are their rights are their rights. I would disagree with
Sure.
that.
I worded that poorly. Somebody within a territory of a governed area in the history of man, once governments started forming, right? Somebody, there has to be at least one, if not a much greater number. And I think we know that the answer is a much greater number of people who wanted to live by different rules and couldn't because of the threat of violence, because of the monopoly on violence that the state or government
I would go
has.
even farther than that. And I would say there's never been a government that existed on any scaled government that didn't violate people's rights. I agree with
Okay,
you.
so that's where we agree. So let me finish answering your one of the many points that you've kind of thrown at me that I haven't really been able to answer. I think that if we can agree that short of Ancapistan, which
I like the
hasn't
name.
existed,
You should
it
copyright that.
hasn't existed and is probably very far off from existing. We agree that government through history and for the foreseeable future violates people's rights, right? So if that is going to happen, it's like me saying to you, the goal should still be to violate those rights as least amount as possible.
I agree
I
with
said
that.
that weird. The
No,
least
no.
amount possible
You basically what you're
until we
saying
reach
is
that.
that, yeah, we are not going to right now make a libertarian utopia in Connecticut, which is ultimately what it's about for us. We live in Connecticut. We're in the Libertarian Party of Connecticut. We're not going to make a libertarian utopia out of Connecticut, but I think we could start to convince people to lower taxes, deregulate the economy, maybe lower the minimum wage, have some school choice. There's things that we can do that would lead to less rights violations that are current than
Sure,
that
and
are
those are
currently
more
occurring.
realistic than secession. But our conversation tonight isn't
No, 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 no,
which
no.
is more realistic,
No.
right?
No. I'm agreeing
Is
with
there
you. What I'm saying is we want to move toward less rights violations. That's ultimately what you're saying, and that's what I'm agreeing
to
with.
me just all forms of, how do I say this? There are levels of evil in everything. And
Okay.
sometimes trade-offs have to happen short of the Ancapistan that I was talking about, right?
Okay.
Trade-offs have to happen and there are levels of evil. I'll give a couple of examples.
Okay.
Violence, force, aggression, just the evil and the immorality behind violence and force and aggression. That we would agree is immoral, using violence toward an innocent person, right?
Yes.
Now, that does not mean that I see it the same for if I see some guy walk up to somebody and just shove them on the ground and start swearing and cussing at them and kind of using like threatening manners to them. I don't see that on the same level as the United States aiding a genocide in Yemen, right? There are levels to this shit, right?
I agree.
So, sorry, can you cuss on your show?
I don't care.
Okay.
I don't think we have
There are
censors.
levels.
If we
There are
do, I'm in
levels
trouble.
of there are levels of evil here. And I think that it is so if a government is going to exist. Now, in my perfect world, we secede down to the individual level. But I'm being forced to defend state secession in the sense that, like, is it just, it's still bad because there's still a state. But I'm almost being put in a situation where I have to defend that state. So keeping that in
But you
mind,
don't want to.
correct. But keeping that in mind, there will always be bad if the state is involved. I think we kind of agreed there, at least mostly. So if the state is going to exist, I want, just like you said, lower the taxes,
Yes.
lower the, lower the incarceration rate of peaceful people, whatever it is, right? So to me, what's more immoral, what's more wrong for a group within a state, because no matter what, a state is going to exist. So one group inside that state, once you secede,
Yeah.
is going to be getting their way, and peaceful people aren't going to be getting their way. That is, again, not my perfect scenario, but I'm being forced to defend that. So here's where I say it's more moral to fight for secession than to say that secession is just wrong. What is more immoral? A group of people saying, hey, listen, we're done with these blood-soaked politician monsters and these people that are stealing from us and making us more poor and supporting the Fed and stealing our money to go send our daughters and sons off to fight these wars, and all of these other just completely evil things that are happening, and them saying, but if you guys want to live under that rule, you're free to move to we'll give. And honestly, if we were talking practicality, if it ever did get to this height, which again, it probably never will, but if it ever did get to this point and the federal government were to allow it, again, none of that would probably happen. I could probably see some agreements being struck up between reasonable people that are saying, hey, we're seceding. We'll give you a year to move out or something like that. But regardless of any of those details, is that more moral, or is it more immoral for the others to say, well, no, you have to stay under those conditions, and I have to take as much of your money as I want, and I have to take and put it where I want it to, including killing poor brown kids 8,000 miles away?
What I think is if you had the overwhelming majority of the citizenry of whatever state you wanted that wanted to live under libertarian principles, and they wanted to form their own government and not pay to the federal
throw out the
government any
libertarian
longer.
part.
No,
Obviously that's a perfect situation.
Yeah, but
any other rules.
But because what I'm saying is that if it's going to be a libertarian government, then like I said before, I don't think people have to consent for it to be just. So if the people still living there are in a situation where they're not having their rights violated, I would have no issue with it. But by the time you convinced enough people of that, I think secession would probably be unnecessary. But Lance, we're running out of time. So before we go, I want to get into some more practical stuff that's a little bit different from the discussion. Thanks for the discussion, by the way. I really appreciate you coming on the show and having it, because I think it's important that within a party, you have different views expressed. Not everybody has to, be on the same page on every issue, when ultimately I think you and I are in favor of the same principles, which boils down to the non-aggression principle in politics. But what I would like to ask you for my listeners is, where would you like to see the state of Connecticut go? What would you like to see the state Libertarian Party advocating and pushing for?
Well, right now, so it's highly improbable that libertarians win political office at the state or federal level, as of now. Hopefully sometime in my lifetime or my daughter's lifetime, that's not the case, right? But I would love to see a situation where we can use whatever influence we do have to start shifting. I want to attack the right from the right and attack the left from the left. You know what I mean? And start really forcing them to be better. And that'll result hopefully in some lower tax. Because one of the examples I give to Republicans all around the state, and Republicans really anywhere in the country, they claim to be for smaller governance, but every Republican administration of my lifetime, I've seen government grow, government agency grow, government taxation grow, the legislation passed, like the Patriot Act, that keeps getting pushed along, but no matter who's in office, the debt grows, the deficit, more importantly, grows. So they're just, like Michael Malice says, they're progressives doing the speed limit, right? So if we can start attacking the right from the right and attacking the left from the left on the issues that they used to be good on. They used to be anti-censorship and anti-war, right? And now you look around in 2023, right? Who's pushing for those things more than the left? So if we can start forcing our way into the conversation and forcing them to be better and forcing them to defend these terrible things that they're doing, it can hopefully at least start impacting some of the legislation at the state level, so that we can get, because this is where it sounds like we agree, but then sometimes it sounds like we don't. I'm for less bad, right? And that doesn't mean, sure, in my perfect world, there'd be no bad. And in my perfect world, we'd be living in Ancapistan, but that's not going to happen. So I want to remove as much bad as I can. And so that's kind of my premise behind why I'm for secession. But that I think is a reasonable, and we can attack it issue by issue. There's some issues that we see that I wish the Libertarian Party was louder in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s about things like gay marriage. We were the first party to take an official stance on get the government out of marriage. They have no
Absolutely.
business telling people who can, you know what I mean? I think single issues are a very good way for us to attack things. So if we take that and put it in the 2020s, right now, parents' rights and parents having say over the schools that they pay for is a huge issue that there's a ton of support out there for. And I think that's one avenue that we can attack and maybe see a little bit more freedom and a little bit more liberty for those parents and those families at the state level.
All right. Hey, Lance, thanks a lot for being here. It's been a lot of
Thank
fun.
you.
I look forward to talking to you and working with you in the future.
Yeah.
Now,
Let's do it again soon.
I'm Michael Liebowitz signing out for the Rational Egoists. See you next time.